Hello, I'm Nico, and in this video, we'll be going over the December 2015 Public Forum Debate Resolution. So let's jump right into it. The resolution this month is resolved. On balance, standardized testing is beneficial to K-12 education in the United States. The first part of the resolution you'll notice is the words "on balance." Don't let this little phrase confuse or intimidate you. Most people just use this as a framework to say that we should weigh the costs and the benefits before coming to a conclusion of, in this instance, standardized testing. Which leads to the second portion of the resolution, which is standardized testing, what you're actually debating this month. Although standardized testing can be defined in several different ways, most definitions include the idea that these tests are standard, that it's the exact same for everyone across the board. Everyone gets the same questions, they're graded the same way, they have the same amount of time to take the tests. This is what standardized testing is. The next portion, which is very important not to forget, are the words beneficial to K-12 education. This means that we aren't talking about how standardized testing affects politics or the economy. Every impact, every argument should come back to the effects of K-12 education. And finally, make sure you look at that last little clause in the resolution, which is "in the United States." I think it's okay to present international examples or different systems to say that these would work. As long as everything comes back to the United States, you should be good. Now that we have a solid understanding of the resolution, let's jump into the arguments that you'll be seeing on each side of the debate this next month. The first category for affirmative arguments to fall under is direct education. Under this lens, we can see that students learn the most important and relevant information with standardized tests. Instead of being taught to learn and memorize everything under a subject, they're guided towards the most useful information for their educational careers and for their lives. Another argument that the affirmative can present is that structure and organization are critical to the development of a student. Starting at a young age and continuing through high school, students need a stable, a static way to both measure their success and learn information. With standardized tests being standard, they are always the same. Your learning habits can stay the same, and you can learn and understand what you need to improve on for the future. Another argument that you can make is that information is the prerequisite to critical thinking. I may have the most analytical mind in the world, but going into a debate that I know nothing about, or trying to calculate the time it would take for me to drive to Canada with no previous mathematical knowledge, would result in failure. Standardized testing verifies that each student knows the key concepts, the core structure of every subject, before moving on to a deeper level of thinking. I think you'll run into a lot of debaters that attack these arguments by saying things like standardized testing doesn't promote creativity or leadership skills. Remember that these are not reasons to vote against the affirmative. They're not reasons why standardized testing is bad. They are reasons why standardized testing isn't the ultimate solution. For example, I could make the argument that debate doesn't teach students how to build a house. That's not a reason why debate is bad, why it shouldn't exist in society. It's just a reason why debate doesn't solve everything. Remember that it's not your burden on the affirmative to solve everything, just to benefit K-12 education, even just a little bit. The second major category is indirect education. Under this category, we see that standardized testing is very low cost. I could run an entire class's worth of bubble sheets through a computer, and within seconds, I'd have and know the results. If you compare this to an essay or creative evaluations, those may take 10 to 15 minutes each student to grade. If the teacher's grading those, that's hours away from class preparation time. If you have a professional grading those, that's a lot of money that you're taking out of the school's budget simply for grading purposes, which also affects the student's education. One might also argue that standardized testing promotes a universal and simplistic way to learn information. Once you study year after year for these standardized tests, when you go into a job setting and they say, learn this information, you can sit down and learn the information using the same studying habits that you've already established throughout your K-12 years. Standardized testing can also create internal competition. A lot of students these days are competition motivated, which means when you have a standardized test which shows them which quartile they're in which subjects, it can help motivate them to be better and to learn more information. If you as the affirmative can show that standardized testing creates a bigger incentive for students to learn, that's a great benefit to education that you have. The third category for affirmative arguments is fairness. Standardized testing is the most objective way to evaluate a student's success. When someone's grading an essay or a piece of art, there will be bias involved. It's inevitable. One grader might like the writing style of one student over another, or hate the political topic that this student chose. There will be bias involved. The only way to reduce this bias is to get rid of that individual grader and their emotions. Once you take that out of the puzzle, you have a traditional standardized test where everyone takes it exactly the same. Remember that everything needs to be brought back to the effects on education. Saying that one test is objective or maybe it's fair is not a reason to vote for the affirmative. Saying that a test is fair, which allows for a more accurate depiction of where students need help or which students need more help, can benefit education in the United States. Everything comes back to education. Standardized testing also allows for more consistent learning across the board. Without a mechanism to measure each student on each year, there will be a bigger break in what kind of information was learned. Standardized tests say that teacher, regardless of what you think, all of your students need to be taught these key concepts. That way, regardless of what district, which city, or what teacher you get, everyone's learning the exact same information and can progress the exact same way. The fourth major category the affirmative has is workarounds. Under this, the affirmative only has to defend that standardized testing is beneficial to K through 12 education, nothing else. Don't let the affirmative force you into defending impacts that don't matter, or force you into defending that standardized testing is the best method to measure a student's success. Another argument that the affirmative can make is that the negative has to prove that a system without standardized testing is better than the status quo, since we have standardized testing now. This would hinge on the affirmative's ability to debate framework and prove to the judge that the negative shouldn't be able to propose any alternatives whatsoever. Another option that you have is to simply adopt, or in debate lingo, perm the negative alternatives that are presented. If they aren't mutually exclusive, if we can do both standardized testing and their alternatives at the same time, that's not a reason to vote the affirmative down. For example, if I said that pizza is beneficial to this party, and someone else stood up and said, actually, ice cream is more beneficial to this party, that's not a reason why pizza is bad. It's simply an addition that we can order both pizza and ice cream. The first major category that negative arguments fall into is direct education. Depending on which study you look at, students spend hours upon hours taking these standardized tests. All of that time is time that could be spent actually learning the subject matter, which would probably be more beneficial to their education. Another argument that you will hear quite frequently on the negative is that standardized testing encourages teaching to the test. If teachers are evaluated based upon the results of these tests, which they generally are, and they know the questions that will be appearing, it creates an incentive for these educators to teach the information that will be on those tests and leave out other important knowledge that these students need to know. The standardized tests are infamous for their ability to teach kids how to regurgitate information. A student can temporarily learn information, ace the test, and forget everything they've learned the very next day. With food regurgitation, none of the nutrients are absorbed. With educational regurgitation, none of the knowledge is actually stored or staying with that kid. Another common argument is that standardized testing has a very narrow lens of information that it tests for, which means that it pushes everything else out. These include critical thinking skills, integrity, leadership, even creativity or artistic skills. If you're running this argument, make sure that you word it in a way that it makes it sound like standardized tests are physically forcing these characteristics and this knowledge out of schools, instead of just not helping them. If you've ever read an ACT or SAT prep book, you know the importance of learning how to guess. A lot of people may argue that standardized testing isn't necessarily a good way to measure a student's educational progress, and even more so, that it teaches the students not to learn the information, but to learn how to guess. The second major category that the negative has is the real-world effects. Now, the first argument under this category is probably one that you've either experienced or heard a lot about, which is that these tests place an immense amount of stress on the students taking them. They are told that this one test defines their future, that regardless of how they've done on previous projects or essays in the past, that it all comes down to this one multi-hour bubble sheet. That's a lot of stress to be placing on their students, and it cannot be good for their health or their education. Another argument that strongly correlates with the last is that standardized testing encourages cheating the system. With so much writing on this one little test, both from a student or a teacher perspective, the incentive to cheat is incredibly high. This has led to students not studying because they can cheat off their neighbor's tests. After all, these tests are standardized. They have the exact same questions. It's also not unheard of for teachers to help their students cheat. This has happened in the past. You might also see people running the argument that standardized testing teaches young students that there are only right and wrong answers, and that this not only destroys their education, since it's not always black or white, sometimes there are gray areas, but that it also destroys the child's perception of the world. In fact, I think you could definitely see some cases running around the circuit that people are running that standardized testing teaches bad life lessons in general. The third category for the negative is discrimination. Arguments that address the students that are left out as a result of standardized testing are going to be very, very prominent. The first of which is creative thinkers. Regardless of how good you are at art or creative writing, if you want to get into a good college or look good in school whatsoever, you're going to have to do well on these tests. So not only do these test scores demean the students that do badly on them, but your artistic or creative future depends upon how well you can fill out a bubble sheet. This also enforces the idea that these artistic skills that the students possess don't matter as much as the next student's ability to memorize information. The next category of individuals that are being discriminated against are ones that I can personally relate to, as well as most debaters can, which is the overthinkers or analytical thinkers. Most everyone has heard the phrase, "go with your gut," in reference to standardized testing. They say that because analytical thinkers will quite literally talk themselves out of the correct answer. For example, in my mind, when I hear the true or false statement, "no mammals lay eggs," I start thinking of all the exceptions to this rule. A platypus is a mammal that also lays eggs, but did the test taker take into account this one little exception? I don't think so. I write false and I end up getting it wrong. Standardized tests disable those individuals that have this advanced or simply different pattern of thinking. Standardized testing also leaves out those students with learning disabilities, students that have English as a second language, or any other student that has a problem with the way the tests were constructed. In most instances, if you don't understand what a word means, you can't simply raise your hand and ask the teacher. These tests are standard, the same questions, the same time limit. It is a one-size-fits-all for humans that are extremely different and come from all different walks of life. It is not beneficial to one's education to treat everyone exactly the same. Once again, if you're running these type of arguments, please, please, please relate it back to how it affects K through 12 education. If you're stopping your arguments at "these tests are bad" or "these tests are unfair," you are not maximizing your arguments and you are doing a disfavor to your case. The fourth and final category for the negative are the workarounds. The first workaround that the negative has is proposing alternatives to standardized testing. And there are a lot of them. Some include doing social or emotional skills testing, games for testing, critical thinking skills, measuring a school based upon its graduation rates, or how well their students perform after they graduate and they're in the workforce. Other propose just having an inspector go inspect the schools and make sure that they're actually learning the information that they should be. There are so many alternatives to standardized testing that the negative could present any number of them and do exceptionally well. The idea behind these alternatives is that the affirmative thinks that it is beneficial to one's education to evaluate and place a quantifiable intelligence number on each student's head and actually grade them like that. So you as the negative, if you can propose a better method of placing a quantifiable number on each student, then you can beat them by playing the exact same game. Another way to ease the resolution in your favor is by making sure the judge knows that the affirmative has the burden of proof. That if you're voting affirmative, you are saying without a doubt, standardized testing increases education, not just neutral, but it actually helps education within the United States. This may not be a tactic that you should rely on, but it can definitely pick you up a few indecisive lay judge ballots. I think it's also important for the negative, along these same guidelines, to clarify that the affirmative has to prove that these tests aren't just objective or that they're the most fair way of evaluating students. That they have to prove that evaluating students in general increases the wealth of education, as the resolution states. The last workaround that you can use on the negative is you can push the benefits that they present from standardized testing off on another aspect of our educational system. For example, if the affirmative made the argument that standardized testing ensures that every student is learning the same information, you as the negative can stand up and say that actually the Common Core ensures that every student learns the same information. I think this could serve as a great generic block. The first tip that I can give you on this topic is to know your studies backwards and forwards. Know the methodology, the author, the publisher, the date that it was published. Get ready to be challenged on your sources. There are so many different staggering numbers on this topic because these studies were done with a different amount of students in different cities and different states. There are so many variables that affect the studies that were done that they all say different things. So know your study and know why it's better than all the rest. The second tip that I have for you is to focus on the topic. I know I sound like a broken record, but make sure that every single one of your impacts comes back to the effects of K through 12 education. The third tip I have for you is to show causation, not correlation. Simple enough. The final tip that I have for you is to ignore the polls. There are so many conflicting polls on this topic. 80% of teachers hate standardized testing. 60% of students think that standardized testing is beneficial to their education. These polls don't prove that there is a benefit to K through 12 education. It's simply one person's opinion, or even the masses' opinion, but that doesn't prove the topic to be true. Save some time in your case by taking out the polls and adding content that actually shows and proves the resolution to be true or false. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, feel free to check out the evidence in our shop and help support us. Share this video with your friends, subscribe, or even tell your coach to show this video in class. Oh, and good luck at the next upcoming tournament.